I got it. It's recording.
Terrific.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. So, and I do find that if I think about this process in a sculptural way, I don't know if any of you guys have watched, there's a reality competition show on HBO Max called The Great Pottery Throwdown. It's a British show, it's a spin off of The Great Bake Off. And it's really fascinating. But watching them formulate their various bowls, cups, vases, those sorts of things that they're making, I see a lot of parallels to what we're doing. And this notion of like the proportionality and beauty of the shape and the shoulder action and the neck and thinking of it kind of like that, like a humanoid silhouette, is I have found for myself very, very useful. So, in order to create that sort of beautiful sculptural vase like quality from the start, the first thing I'm going to do is scrape a few scrapes from about a third to a halfway down the length of the blank to establish some flow from the heart region into the tip region. And as I scrape up on those first few strokes, I'm going to add a little bit of pressure. So I already start creating sort of a taper, a flowing taper from the heart region into the tip region. And then I'm going to stop coming back so far and start just focusing more on just the tip region itself. So I've established a connectivity from the heart into the tip, which is going to give it a little bit less of that rigid, defined, like thick bark and then tip, and more of a connected sort of scrape, but not too much of it that I'm going to accidentally over scrape the heart region. So this is what it's going to look like. Okay. So, and for this process, I do like to use a beveled knife. I find a beveled knife gives me an edge that tends to be a little bit more of what I call, and I know you all have heard me call this, a buttery edge. And by buttery, I mean that it's going to remove the cane, but not in a way where it's creating a lot of little kind of chips and chisels or niches in the cane. I want it to do so really smoothly. So I start, as I said, about a third to a halfway down the reed, and I'm going to take a few longer scrapes up and kind of increase pressure. I've already stopped going back as far after those first 3 or 4 scrapes. And I'm also, while I'm doing this, kind of searching for places on the knife where the edge feels really, really good while I do this. And I'm going to kind of really try to focus on, because the better quality of the scrape you do in at every stage in the reed making process, the more beautiful and clean and smooth your work is, the more vibrant the reed's going to be, and the more control you'll have over sort of the finishing stage. So that's what I've done so far. Okay, so see, I'm about almost halfway down. I did a few strokes up, and then you can see when I show you the profile view, maybe I'll put something dark behind it, that it's already starting to get sort of this shoulder into neck action going from the top of the heart region into the tip. And the taper in the tip looks like what my teacher in undergrad used to call a ski slope. He called this stage of reed making establishing the slope. The difference is when he would do it, his slope would be more of like a straight line almost. Whereas I'm going for something that has this kind of curvature to it. So there's a slight, almost bulb forming, sort of where the top of the heart's going to be, and then a smooth hint of a concavity beginning to form in the bottom of the tip up into the very tip of the tip. Okay? Now what I'm going to do is flip the reed over and do the exact same thing on the other side. I like to not do one side completely and then do the other side. I like to do each step and do it on one side and then the other side, because I find that I get much better symmetry if I do it this way and do it sort of one step at a time. So I'm going to do the other side, same thing, and then I'll show you what it looks like.
I
And
have
then
a
we're going
question,
to
Dr.
take a
Parker.
brief pause there to let people attempt to do that on their own reed. Feel free to watch while I do this, or if you feel ready to and comfortable, go ahead and just be working on your own. So a few long scrapes, just a handful, and then start pulling your scrape not as far back anymore and focus on what will ultimately be the tip region. For those of you who haven't been doing this as long, it might not be a bad idea to mark on your blanks where that 66 millimeter mark is before you even start this step, so that you know you're not going to be kind of pulling where you want to place the tip back a little too far, right? What happens if the base of the back is too far down and too much in the heart region? That's when you start getting more and more flatness and instability in your reed. So I've just done the same thing on the other side. I'm hoping that now I have pretty good symmetry, and that's what the profile is starting to look like. So you can see that there's a little bit of that nice sculptural quality. The tip has a nice taper to it, looks pretty symmetrical. And having those long pieces of cane stick out from the top, that's good. Okay, so we take a brief pause, and you go ahead. And if at any point anybody wants to show their work or ask a question, please do so. And in about a minute, I will continue along with the next step of the process.
Dr. Parker, the shoulder that you're talking about,
Yes.
does that need to start at 66 or ahead of 66?
When you say ahead of 66, do you mean underneath 66 or above 66?
I mean at 67 or 68.
Okay. I tend to keep that transition part a little higher early on so that I'm avoiding it being too low. Now, I'm not trying to say, all right, I'm going to make sure that that sort of rounded top of the heart is at 67. I'm just like sort of focusing on keeping it up a little higher in the reed proportionately, and then I will, once I clip the reed open, I'll kind of measure it and I can adjust, and I usually do have to pull it back just a little bit in that early stage.
Okay.
So yes, to answer your question, without being so precise about it, I am being very careful to make sure that we're at the very least at 66, if not slightly above it.
Okay.
Okay.
Dr. Parker,
Yes.
I'm just curious what knife you were using, and that must be your sort of bark knife.
Yeah, this is my Chiarugi beveled bark knife.
The beveled knife. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I always use, in fact, I've been using all beveled knives in my reed making in general recently. And it's mostly because I was having a lot of trouble getting my Jendi sharp up a couple months ago. And so I just kind of set it aside for the time being. And I've been focusing entirely on my beveled knives and having generally good results. It's been interesting, though, seeing that the basic feel of my reeds have changed a slight bit since I've stopped using my wedge razor knife. My reeds are showing different tendencies. So it's interesting how even the nature of the edge you're using can show up in the reeds you make. Lately, my reeds have been having the opposite issue they normally have, which is they usually feel a little too flat to me. But lately, I've been having a little bit of a tougher time getting my reeds to be down and deep enough. So is that a byproduct of something going on? In the weather? Is that the cane I've been using? It's hard to factor in all the variables, but it definitely started when I started using my beveled knives. The good thing about the Chiarugi beveled knife is they're pretty cheap as far as knives go. It's around $40 or something, which, my Jendis cost $110. So, the beveled knife, and this is what John Ferrillo uses, not Chiarugi necessarily, but beveled knives. I think they use the really fancy Japanese steel ones like the Andos.
No, he has his own now. It's like the Harvard Hologround or something.
Yeah. But anyway, they their whole system, the NEC John Ferrillo system of scraping and knife sharpening is all entirely based on those beveled knives. Cassie's familiar with it because she worked a little bit with Courtney Miller on that. Exactly. So if anybody ever wants to learn how to use the jig system of sharpening, talk to Cassie. And remember, guys, this is something that I never heard teachers talk about. And I've studied with a handful of different teachers about on reed making, some of the best I think in the country, and they all have their own different styles and philosophies and approaches. But I never once heard anybody say that the energy you bring to this process, your mindset, the way you scrape, the way you think about what you're doing, bringing a certain kind of care and thoughtfulness and joy even to the process, what a difference that makes over the long haul in the results you come up with. It's very easy when you're making reads to get into a negative headspace, or to get to move too quickly, or to get bored, or to not pay attention to your body. I notice I'll be making reads and really focused, and an hour later my body feels like it got put through a wood chipper. It's so sore. So just, taking stock, paying attention, taking care of yourself, focusing on having a good, healthy mindset while you do this, focusing on making the work beautiful, taking your time with it, not rushing it. All of these things have a huge impact. I cannot stress enough what an impact that has on the results you make over time. So please be mindful of that. You will be so happy with your results if you really take care of those things. Any questions so far? Olivia?
Can I see the profile view of your read again, please? Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and start moving on to the next step, and I'm going to explain what I'm doing. I'm going to explain what I'm doing, but if you're not there yet, if you're still working on this first step, that is totally fine. Okay? You do work at whatever pace you're comfortable with, get whatever information you can. Those of you who are maybe at this point needing to go a little slower, I'm going to be going over all this with you in your lessons individually as well. This is not the only time you're going to get all this information. Okay? All right, so I'm going to change my camera angle again. And so for the next step, what I'm going to be interested in doing is beginning to pull this scrape back a little further now, and sort of scrape down, through the heart region down into the back a little bit, and just kind of pull that sculpture further down the reed, and simultaneously continue working on, getting the tip more and more tapered and where I want it. So first I start a little further back from where my initial scrape had started, and I'm beginning to create channels in the reed. I don't want to put too much pressure. I don't want to over scrape the heart region. And I want to make sure that while I do this, I'm really mindful of maintaining the integrity of the spine and the rail. So I just did it on this side a little bit. You can see now this was the side I haven't done yet. This is the side I just started pulling it down. And can you see those clear channels? There's a clear spine and clear rails. So I'm just making sure to plant the blade of my knife sort of in the central portion of each channel. And as I scrape up, I'm really mindful about not letting it scrape, unintentionally through the spine or through the rails. I'm just really trying to be precise. Now I've gone all the way back, and I pulled the scrape all the way back to the base of the reed, and I took a tiny bit more out of the back region, and that's as much of that part as I'm going to do now. So that's what I've done on this side. Okay, and I haven't done it, so then I go to the other side and I do the same thing. Pull the channels back a little bit at a time. Make sure not to compromise the spine. Now, you don't need a big thick spine. You don't want a big, thick spine. In fact, that can make a reed feel dull and unvibrant and thuddy. So you want a definite spine, but you want it to be sort of elegant and beautiful, like the spine of a ballet dancer, not an ogre. Okay. So now I've done both sides. So we've got pretty good symmetry going on. I'll change the view so I can show you a better profile view. So right now there's not a lot of sort of contouring between the back and the heart. There's a little hint of it where there's a little more out of the back, but I haven't really created much of a waist yet, and I'm not going to create a lot of a waist at this point, just some. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is now I'm going to take my knife back to my rod because it's starting to lose a little bit of the excellent quality of edge it had up until now. And I want to really keep that at all points during this process so I can get the best possible result. Okay, so now, before I go back and take any more out of the body of the reed, I'm just going to do a few more touches to the tip. I want to get a little more taper. I want to get the very tip of the tip thinner. I like to have a really nice taper and a really pretty thin, very tip of the tip at this point. So when I clip the reed open, it's already going to be able to peep to some degree. It won't be a full-blown crow. If it is a full-blown crow at this stage, that usually means I took a little too much out of the body of the reed somewhere. And then I end up having to spend the rest of my time trying to refine the reed while also bringing it up to pitch and stabilizing it. That is hard to do. I'd much rather have to bring the pitch of a reed down than have to try to bring it up. I mean, certainly at this early stage. So I'm just doing some more touches to the tip, getting a little more taper. I'm trying to stay away from the very middle of what I call the cloud region of the tip. And then the last thing I'm going to do is go ahead and take a little bit more out of the channels of the back and to get a little bit more of that beautiful humanoid silhouette. And then that'll probably be about it before I clip it open.
Could you point out the cloud region at some point?
Absolutely, Maddie. Absolutely. So I will show you that right now. And I think this is ready to be clipped open. Yep, that's the look we're going for. It looks like a reed, just still a little, but with a little more substance on it. So first, to answer Maddie's question, the cloud region is all through kind of here, sort of above the spine of the heart, all through here. This is the part where you don't want to over scrape at any point. That's responsible for a reed having enough warmth, enough stability. When we take a little too much out of that cloud region of the reed, that's when we start getting really buzzy, wild, unattractive tones. Okay, now take a look at this profile. This is about right before when a reed is ready to clip open. Okay, so you can see it already has that sort of sculptural hint of a Coke bottle shape. Tip has a nice taper to it. There's a little hint of a waist. The heart looks rounded and not square and geometric. So I'm going to clip it open, but I'm not going to go to the next step yet. I'm going to give everybody about 5 minutes now to kind of catch up or move ahead if you already know what's coming next. Any other questions at this point besides Maddie's?
Do I leave the rails on the heart?
What'd you say?
Should we leave the rails on the heart?
I do leave a little bit of rail on the heart at this stage. I've noticed that most of the time the rails on my heart kind of disappear as I'm going through more of the finishing processes of a reed. but I really try to maintain the rails in the back of the reed though.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I don't think they're as important in the heart, or they don't need to be quite as thick, but definitely in the back. Who was it the other day that their back had the Y shape? Was that Olivia?
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah. So Olivia's been doing some research. Now I'm going to show you what this looks like now that it's been clipped open, because it kind of makes it click into place. So you see how it looks like a prototype of a reed kind of in the shape, but there's no real definition at the base of the tip yet. That's what I'm going to put in next when I go to my next stage.
Dr. Parker, are you clipping like as little as possible or like a healthy millimeter?
Oh, my first clip is pretty healthy. I'd say it's probably about, I don't know exactly, but I would say it's definitely like probably around a solid millimeter. Yeah, my read now is 70, almost 71 millimeters long, and I wrapped it at 72. So it was a solid millimeter clip. I think that's part of the reason why it's so important for me to get a lot of nice taper in that tip early on. Because if you don't get enough taper and you do a larger clip in the first stage, then you're going to end up with a really thick top of the tip, and it's going to be tough to get vibration going quickly at this point. So everybody take a minute. And then at any point, if anybody would like to show their work or would like to, would like to ask a question about what they're doing so far, we can do that.
Can we hear the crow that your reed makes at this point?
I can't hear you.
Oh,
I mean, I could hear you, but you were muddled or something. Try that again.
I was asking if we could hear what the reed is supposed to sound like after you clip it open.
Sure, absolutely. So ideally, and we'll see if I got it right, it should make a very high-pitched peep when you blow a fair amount of air into it. So it shouldn't feel vibrant at this point, but it also shouldn't feel impossible for it to make a sound. Absolutely exactly what I'm looking for.
Cool. Is
that what you got?
Yeah, can I show you the profile of this guy?
Yeah?
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to change the view because you're a tiny little window. Okay, no. Okay.
Okay.
Good, I can see it now. Can you twist it a little bit more? You don't have a dead-on profile. A little bit back the other way. There, that's good. Yeah, I mean, it looks pretty good. The only thing I'd say is, and it's hard to tell on Zoom because I've noticed that Zoom camera makes everything look a little thicker, but I feel like you could have a little more taper in your tip. I feel like it could kind of come in a little bit more
at the shoulder or at the tip.
At the very tip. It feels like it kind of stays the same thickness. I feel like you could have a little more taper.
Okay.
But once again, that could just be the way the Zoom camera makes things look a little thicker than they are. So if anybody got to the stage which they were able to clip their initial profile open, would they like to try to peep it and let's see what kind of sound it makes, if anything?
I can do that.
All right. Good. Very similar to mine. I think that's a good pitch. It sounds like it's maybe a C sharpish, somewhere around there. That's great. And no bottom octave, and it wasn't super responsive. It should be responsive, but not super responsive. And you definitely don't want any rattle at this point. If you clip your reed open after your initial scraping and it already is rattly in the crow, then you over scrape something. Now, that doesn't mean you can't fix it and make it work. All it means is it's much harder to end up with a reed with a beautiful tone that way. Then you basically spend the rest of your time just trying to fix the mistake you made. The better option is to not make any mistakes from the beginning and gradually unfold the vibrations from the reed, always maintaining that kind of pitch and tonal integrity while you do so. Wait, sorry, I have to change my view.
Mhm.
Nice. Good taper. The only thing I'd say is the wrong part of your heart is the thickest part. You've got that issue where it's thicker at the bottom of the heart and then it tapers continually from the bottom of the heart to the tip.
Mhm.
Remember, we talked about wanting the thicker part of the heart. If you look at my profile, you can see the thicker part of the heart is actually up more towards the top of the heart underneath the tip. So that's the only thing I'd say you would want to change a little bit about your initial scraping, is to try to have the heart actually sort of thicken a little bit from the bottom of the heart up towards the top, and then start to decrescendo into the tip.
Okay.
Okay,
Maddie,
now that doesn't mean you can't make a read from that. It just means, once again, that perhaps your ability to create that really compact, warm, held together quality might be a little bit harder.
Maddie,
Now,
can you see
I've
the
met
profile?
great oboists that have told me that they make reads in the opposite way I do, where they actually start their initial scraping just to get the reed vibrating like crazy, and then they spend the rest of the time trying to build in protection, warmth, and stability. Whereas I prefer to keep it sort of overly held together and gradually release the vibration. It's just a personal taste thing. So, take everything I'm telling you, experiment with it, try it out, but come up with your own methods. Oh, that was a weak one. Okay, good. Any other questions anybody else want to share? Okay. Maddie, what did you clip your read open?
No, Danny wanted to see the profile again, so I was just.
Oh, I missed the chat.
Mhm.
Could I crow mine for you?
Absolutely. Good. Good. High pitched, no bottom octave, doesn't speak right away, but isn't completely unvibrant. That's exactly what I'm looking for before I've made a tip on my read. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move ahead now to the next step. Feel free to watch as I do this, or not, and just listen. Your choice. So now is when I actually make my cut in at the base of the tip. And I'm going to make my cut in definitely no lower than absolutely the lowest part of the cut in the bottom corner of the tip. I'm going to make sure it's no lower than 66, and in fact at this point it's often a little higher. I don't measure it. I've been doing this long enough that I can tell with my eye, but you very well may want to measure yours, because if you start with that tip too low, you're going to make it much harder once again to get that pitch stability. Now, why do we end up, when we're still working out our reed making, moving that tip down too low? It's usually because we're having trouble getting our reed to vibrate enough. And so we start unconsciously or consciously moving that tip down, because it does give us more and more vibration. But what you have to do is figure out how to get more and more vibration from your reed in a way that's going to not sacrifice the integrity and the potential of pitch stability, particularly a reed being up to pitch enough in the high register. That's the first thing that goes when you start moving below that 66 mark. So I'm putting a cut in. Now, remember what I said before about the level of definition in a reed should be directly proportionate to how finished it is. So I'm putting in the sketch of a cut in right now. I'm not going to put in this super aggressive, sharp cut in. And if you're watching right now, you may be noticing I'm also moving back and working on other parts of the reed too. Even though my primary focus right now is making a tip, I'm not going to just leave every other part of the reed completely untouched. If I see things that are a little barky or things that are a little asymmetrical, I may just go in there and do a bit there. So the tip is the thing I'm focusing on the most, but I'm also trying to bring along the rest of the reed a little bit, just kind of slightly behind the tip. I guess I'm kind of thinking of building the reed around the tip being the most finished part of the reed at any given moment until the very end. So that's as much definition as I put in at this point. you can see there's a clear line, but I haven't dug in and cut in really harshly. I may add more of that later. It's very easy to sharpen your definition. It's much harder to successfully blend it out when you've put in a huge amount of it to begin with. Okay? Now I'm going to do that same thing on the other side.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
When you're putting the cut in, like you're saying, are you doing a follow through scrape all the way to the tip, or just at the base of the tip?
Oh, always doing a follow through. I mean, to some degree, I'm not always going all the way up to the top corner, but I'm always kind of scraping from the cut in sort of diagonally upward towards the corner of the reed.
Okay.
And then I kind of work my way up. And I'm also, while I'm doing this, I'm going to constantly stop and check my work. I'm going to flip the reed over and look at the other side to keep checking for that symmetry. My goal someday is to get to the point where I can't tell which side is which. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but that's kind of what I'm trying to do. I have heard a couple oboists say that one blade of the reed should be slightly thicker or heavier than the other. And that may be true. That may be true for them. I may be doing that without even being aware of it, since I don't really measure my reeds with a micrometer. But I really do find I tend to get the best results in my reed making the more I aim for absolute mirror symmetry. All right. I've done the tip on both sides now, and I can guarantee you it's probably above 66, which is part of the reason why I leave the cut in a little bit less sharp, so I can move it back if need be without a lot of trouble. So there's one side, there's the other, and there's what the profile is looking like so far. See, zoom really does make it look a little thicker. It definitely looks more tapered to my eye than it does on zoom.
Can you use your reed
Now,
case as a background again?
What?
Can you put the reed case behind it so we can see a little clearer, please? Yeah.
There. That's more like what it actually looks like.
Okay. And you still stay out of that cloudy region you were talking about earlier?
Always. I mean, yes, to a certain degree. I mean, I don't leave like, it depends on what you mean by that. I don't leave like an incredible thick amount of bark there or something. It's just that it's definitely a little bit thicker. If you've seen those posters I have on my wall in my studio, one of them has like proportionate measurements. So it's like the side of the tip is like at a 1. You know, the heart is like a 3 or a 4. And then the center of the tip is at 1.5. So the center of the tip is definitely thinner than the heart, for example. It's just thicker than the side. So that's what I mean when I say don't scrape too much out of the cloud. Okay, now I'm going to crow this reed, and if I've done things right and if everything was set up properly, it should crow in a way where it needs to be clipped. It shouldn't be insanely wild. Yep. So it's kind of a saggy C with a little bit of rattle, not much, a very small amount. That's probably exactly where I want it, because that's a reed that needs just one clip for the time being. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to measure where the base of the tip is in terms of how far from the bottom of the staple to compare it to that 66 mark and make any adjustments. And if I have to pull it back, I'm actually only going to pull it back on the bottom corner. So I'm actually going to slightly evolve the angle of the peak at the top of the heart and make it more steep by pulling just the bottom corners back to that 66 mark. It can handle one more little tiny clip. And now the overall length of this reed is 70 66.5. And the base, the bottom corners of the tip are at 66.25. So I'm going to just move the bottom corners down by 1/4 of a millimeter and just make them a little bit more like a V, and I'll show you what that looks like. And that's as much as I want to clip it. And you'll hear there's a tiny bit of an upper partial in there. There's no thin spots in the tip, so what that means is just that as of right now, the tip is vibrating proportionately a little more than the heart is. I mean, the tip should always be vibrating more than the heart, but the proportion is a tiny bit too extreme. So I will lower the bottom corners of my tip to 66, then I will test the crow again, and if it still has that slight chirp / upper partial, it means I need to take some bark and material out of my heart and get that vibrating, and that'll make the crows start to sound more integrated. Everything somewhat clear so far? Excellent. Any questions while I sharpen my knife?
If the crow is buzzier than we would like, that means we scraped too much, right?
If the crow is wild at this point, or buzzy or rattly, then it means probably that some part of the reed that I would consider something you need to protect a little bit more was not protected as much. That could be the cloud region of the tip. It could be that part of the heart I was referring to with you. If you weaken sort of the upper half of the heart a little too much, that could contribute to a little more wildness in the crow. But for most of the time when that happens, it means you took too much out of the middle of the tip somewhere. That's the most common source of that degree of buzziness. All right, so I'm putting my plaque in. I just touched up my knife. I'm going to go ahead and just very carefully pull those bottom corners of the tip back and just sharpen the definition while I'm at it a hair, and then scrape up the side of the tip slightly. So I'm kind of doing some refining while also pulling the tip back to that final position at 66. Now I'm beginning to notice that the quality of the edge of my knife is slowly degrading from where it was when I first started scraping this blank. So that means one of two things. It means I need to slightly adjust the angle I'm using when I go to the rod for the time being, or it means that I need to go back to the stone. Okay, so I've lowered the tip so I have a little more of a steeper V at the top of the heart now, because I've lowered the angle. I've lowered the bottom corner slightly. Okay, now I'm going to crow it again. Still has a little bit of that upper partial, and the bottom octave is a little bit too disconnected from the rest of the crow. So that points to what I thought might be the issue before, which is for now there's a little too much bark in the heart. So I'm going to very carefully smooth that out some. Yeah, and knife edge is not there. So we go to the rod or whatever you use to hone your edge, and I'm going to try a little bit of a steeper angle, and I'm going to listen to the sound it's making to see if I can get that really beautiful, crisp kind of whisking sound. And there we go. Now the edge is back to high quality again. So listen to your knife. It's telling you what it needs. Okay. So I'm just smoothing up the body of the reed a little bit, focusing particularly on any part of the heart that looks a little barky. And at this point, for me, a lot of times there's usually a little too much cane in the spine of the heart. So I'm sort of narrowing the spine ever so slightly. There we go. That's got a nice, elegant profile now. No more upper partial. It's been completely scraped out now. Now it's just a pure octave crow. Bottom octave is still a little more hesitant than I'd like, which says that there's still a little too much cane in the heart. Before I do that, though, this is what the profile's looking like now. Actually, there's enough bottom octave there, and the crow is sitting a little low for where I want it right now, so I'm going to go ahead and clip it one more time. We brought the pitch of it down a little bit when I brought the corners down and took a little more cane out of the body of the reed, so we can clip it again. Now this very well might make the bottom octave start to disappear again, in which case I'll have to really carefully now smooth a little more bark out of the heart and perhaps blend it ever so slightly into the tip to get a little more communication between the tip and the heart. Because that's really how the vibration flows from the tip into the heart and body of the reed is really what determines the nature of the octaves in the crow. Good. I clipped it and it raised the pitch a little bit, but there's still a pretty good amount of bottom octave. It feels a hair resistant now, and the connection between the top and bottom octave could be a little better. So I'm going to put my plaque back in, which allows me to see how much bark is still in the heart region, and I still see plenty. So we're going to do a little bit more debarking of the heart carefully, and then I'm going to follow through and sort of refine the tip. I see a little bit of thickness up at the very tip of the tip on one side. So I'm going to refine that a little bit. There. Okay, same thing on the other side now. And you can tell if you're watching, I'm really making sure the very tip of the tip is really beautifully tapered and smoothly scraped so it doesn't have little tears and stuff in it. And this is really a matter of getting the right kind of edge on your knife. Some people have no difficulties with knife sharpening. Some people are very challenged by it. I'm one of the ones that's very challenged by it. I've had to work extremely hard over the years to get remotely consistent and good at it, and I still feel like I've got a long way to go. So if you're one of those types, know that you're not alone, and know that there are solutions. And you guys have a lot of good resources now that weren't around when I was your age. You know, lots of tutorials on YouTube that are very helpful, I think, for sort of unlocking the mystery of good knife sharpening. So I highly suggest you seek out that information if it's something you struggle with. Because really, at the end of the day, that's pretty much what determines whether you're going to make a good read or not. Okay, so I just did a little more smoothing of the heart, a little tiny bit of refining of the tip. The crow should be now a pretty balanced octave, a C, maybe slightly saggy, and hopefully I'll be able to do one more clip, and that's what I would call a day one read at that point. Exactly right. We've got a good response. The bottom octave is present but not wild. There's a recognizable pitch stability, and it's a little low. So we clip it, and that should be about right. One more clip. I've noticed from my reeds, and you may have noticed this yourself, or maybe your reeds do something different, but my reeds tend to lower a tiny bit that first night of drying. So if I put a reed crowing something between a C and a C sharp upon my first making of it, if I take it out the next day and soak it up, it'll crow a C. If I put it away crowing a C sharp, I'll take it out the next day, it'll crow between a C and a C sharp. They seem to sync and open up a tiny bit for me. So I always then now put them away a little bit higher and tighter than I normally would, so that when I take them out the next day, they will have sunk into a good place. Still can do one more clip. In fact, I'm going to just clip an incredibly slight angle to it, just to slightly almost over-stabilize the crow. That's pretty close. This is a day one read. It's not gonna sound particularly good, but just for the sake of this demonstration, I want to show you how it functions now, how it sounds on the oboe, and how it plays, so that you can get a sense of the way my reeds tend to play at this early stage of their development. Not that it'll give you a lot of nuance over Zoom, but at least you'll be able to sort of tell what its functionality is at this stage. And while my oboe is warming up, I will show you the view one more time. So here it is through the light. It's about 70 millimeters long now, which is a good length to put it away at day one. There are many oboe players that believe 70 is a finish length. There are some people that finish their reeds even longer than that, and that's totally fine. It doesn't work for me, but there are many people who do that. For me, my reeds tend to finish at 69. So this is what the profile looks like. Can you see how it has that kind of neck, head, and beak of a duck or swan look to it? There's a smoothly, beautifully sculpted sort of Coke bottle shape in there. Tip has a nice taper to it. All right, let's see how it works. So it plays. It's a little bit sort of fuzzy sounding, a tiny bit congested sounding. I'm going to ultimately want a little more clarity, a little bit more of a crystalline quality from it. Right now it just sounds a little fuzzy, but it's pretty free blowing. There's pretty good pitch stability. There's enough depth for the low register to respond pretty well. It's a functioning reed that just needs some refinement now. Okay, so that's my version of a day one reed. Any questions at this point? Any observations? Any criticisms?
Can I play this crow for you?
What?
Can I play a crow for you?
Yes, absolutely. Good. I mean, from what I can hear over Zoom, that sounds like a pretty healthy crow. It definitely sounds like, I mean, if you think it's free blowing enough, it sounds to me like you could maybe clip it one more time for the time being.
Okay, yeah.
But only if you think it feels free blowing enough.
Well, I was worried it was too low, but I'm not really good at judging the threshold of pitch yet.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't feel, super confident about their, reed pitch hearing, because I don't have perfect pitch, but I have perfect reed pitch for whatever reason, If you don't have perfect reed pitch yet, then you just have a tuner with you while you're doing this and just keep checking it with your tuner and develop a sense of what where you want it to be. Some of you may not want to do a C sharp crow like I do. Actually, ideally my reeds crow between a C and a C sharp. My best reeds tend to. So I shouldn't even say C sharp, although there are some oboe players that go for that. But most oboe players go for a C crow, and if that's what you do, that's fine, as long as it works for you. Okay, how are the freshmen doing?
I'm still working on my stuff, but my reed cracked.
That's
there's too many.
I'm sorry I'm laughing. It's because it sounds like you're inside of a stadium, right?
Oh.
on a megaphone.
Okay. Well, I was saying that my reed cracked. I think it was just the batch of reeds that I made with a bunch of blanks weren't as as good as I wanted it to be. Right. But still learning. But yeah, my reed cracked.
No problem. Do you have a second blank you can try starting?
Oh, sorry. Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah. Do you have a second blank with you can try starting?
Yeah, I'm setting it right now.
Excellent. Perfect. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're doing pretty well. I think we've kind of folded crow analysis into the conversation, but I will I will go a little further with the discussion about crow analysis now, and I'm going to actually maybe start scraping on my second blank while I do that. So, if I say anything that is confusing, or if you want this to be reinforced, I know most of you probably know this already, but I do have a video on YouTube where I talk about crow analysis, so refer to that. But I wanted to give you a little bit more of an in-depth, real-time sort of discussion about that. I do think it's a good skill to have and a good goal to have, to try once in a while to make a read. I think Olivia and I were talking about this in her lesson, but to try to make a read all the way to finished. And I don't mean in one day necessarily. You can do it over the course of a few days like you would normally do, if that's how you normally do it. But to do it without ever putting it in your oboe. To see if you can get all the way to a refined, finished read, only using crow analysis to get you there. And it should absolutely be doable. 100% that should be a totally doable thing. So, but obviously in order to do that, you have to really understand how to crow properly and how to analyze it. So there are basically three main categories of things we're testing when we crow a read: response, pitch, and tone. And I listed them in their order of importance. Of course, they're all very connected to one another. They all influence one another, but learning how to sort of separate them out and analyze them individually is very helpful. But response has to be number one. And this is the biggest pitfall that oboe students tend to fall into. And not just students. I know many, professional oboe players that can fall into this pitfall too. Whereas we're so focused on a beautiful tone that we sacrifice response and pitch to get it. And, what good is a beautiful tone if you can't play, all the way through something without getting exhausted, or you can't have like pitch stability? And also, then we have to talk about what is the difference between a beautiful tone and good pitch, and is there really a difference? Is a tone beautiful if it's not perfectly in tune? I don't think it is. So yeah, how do we analyze response? Well, that one's easy. That one's the most objective of the lot. So what we want to do to analyze response is to crow our reed as softly as possible and gradually increase our airspeed until it vibrates. And then we're going to sort of analyze what dynamic level that is. If a reed doesn't respond really easily and well at a very soft dynamic, then it's not really a truly functioning reed. Obviously, it's very difficult to make a reed that can do that ideally, certainly with any great consistency. And so, yes, we're going to have reeds at times that are pretty good reeds that maybe not able to do that. And, more often than not, we make reeds that can't do quite everything. So you have to become very masterful at just sort of knowing where to stop and knowing, what to allow a reed to be able to do, and maybe knowing that certain reeds are good for some things and not for other things. But that being said, from a purely objective level, it is good to try to make a reed that can respond at a very soft dynamic. So that's what I do when I crow. And I just brought out my day one reed I just scraped. So you can hear it starts making some sort of vibration, some sort of peep the second air touches it. I'm blowing very, very, not a high volume of air. It's what the kind of air I'd be blowing if I was playing piano or pianissimo. So we know this reed has pretty good response. Now, I've been doing this long enough to know that that is still even a little too resistant ultimately for what I'm looking for. I can feel the thickness of the reed still when I try to crow it. And you will become more sensitive to that. You will get to the point where you can crow a reed and you'll say, oh, yeah, there's a little too much in the spine of the heart on one side. You can just start to feel the way the reed is vibrating when you crow it. You get better and better at that through experience. Okay? So that's step one in your crow analysis, is start at a very soft dynamic, test how quickly it responds, and that'll tell you, does this truly respond immediately enough and freely enough, allow me to play with a full dynamic range, allow me to play softly in the low register, softly in the high register, and all of the above. So next step, pitch analysis, right? This is somewhat objective, right? What's not objective is what pitch feels right to you ultimately. And that can also not just be dependent on how you play your instrument, but it's dependent on the instrument you play. Some oboes, my older oboe definitely sits sort of generally lower than my newer oboe. So I need a reed that's a little more up to pitch for my older oboe, and I need a reed that has a little more lowness in it for my newer oboe. So you have to kind of figure out what melds well with your instrument. But I'm going to operate for the time being under the principle that, for me, generally speaking, I want a reed that crows between a C and a C sharp. So once again, if you don't have perfect reed pitch, then use a tuner or be sitting by a piano, keyboard, something to help you really measure what exactly pitch your reed is crowing. The most important thing here is to recognize that the pitfall people fall into with this step of the crow analysis is that they're actually helping their reed crow a certain pitch. Sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. But 9 out of every 10 student I meet and work with in some capacity, when they're in their reed making and I observe them, I see that they crow their reeds up to the reed ceiling. Almost every oboist I know plays on flat reeds and holds them up. It's a total, very pretty universal thing. So first of all, be very honest with yourself. Are you helping the reed to crow higher than it really does at its lowest point? This is what I mean when I say blow to the pitch floor. So you want to crow your reed as low as you can. My reed doesn't want to go any lower than that. Okay? So be very honest with yourself about whether you're helping the reed up or not when you crow. And that'll be your true pitch. The pitch floor is the true pitch of the reed. Okay?
Dr.
Good.
A question about the pitch floor.
Yeah, go ahead.
So normally when I crow on the reeds, if I do like the little breath crow, it'll crow a certain pitch. And then when I overblow it to get the bottom octave, it might lower.
That's a sign of some sort of instability in the reed.
Okay.
Now, is that instability a bad thing entirely? No, I mean, it depends on how unstable. It depends on how you play your instrument. You may need a reed that has that. My reeds don't do that. I can't get the pitch to change. And that's what I know.
You're not getting the bottom octave on that reed.
I can, yeah.
Okay, I say the same, yeah.
But the pitch doesn't change whatever dynamic I blow it at. So it's going to be the same soft as it is loud. And that's just, I guess what I want my reeds to feel like, what I want them to do. If it doesn't do that, then you've got to figure out, well, where in the reed is that stability being compromised at all? Where is that, for my taste, maybe slightly excessive amount of freedom in the reed coming from? But if it's not a problem, it's not a problem. If you like your reeds, if they feel comfortable, if they're allowing you to play efficiently and well, then and they do that, then there's no problem. That's what you need.
I don't think that's true, but let's say I needed to add more stability. Would I just clip?
That's something I can't answer in a vacuum. That's the kind of thing you have to take on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
It really just depends on what caused that in that particular reed. It's possible a clip would help, but it's possible that a clip would just exacerbate the tightness of the reed without resolving the instability, in which case you end up with a reed that feels both unstable and shallow. I've had that reed before. It seems a little counterintuitive, but those reeds exist. In fact, I tried to practice on one yesterday, and it was quite painful. Okay. Anything else? Oh, Emily, sorry, I missed your question. What was the starting length? I wrapped my reed at 72.
Dr. Parker, I have a quick question.
Yes.
Have you ever noticed in your reads, depending on the blade, if like the left side or the right side was thicker or thinner, depending on like since you're right hand dominant, do you find that the right side is thinner than the left side?
Yes, I have noticed that. Absolutely. And I've not only noticed that sometimes one side is thinner than the other, but also that, the structures look a little bit different.
Mhm.
Right? And so this goes to what we were talking about with symmetry before, really trying to get the front blade and the back blade to look the same, but also trying to get the left side and the right side of each blade to look the same. And I find that I have the same tendencies on one side as I have on the other. So I've had to gradually learn over time how to compensate for the tendencies that are created structurally based on whether or not I'm scraping on my dominant side or the opposite side. So the important point you bring up here, David, is that you really need to sort of be aware that that's possible, that you won't scrape the left and right side of a reed exactly the same because of the angle at which you have to scrape it. And so to be aware of that and to really carefully observe for that and to try to teach yourself how to compensate for the side you're scraping on.
Mhm.
That's a good question. Now, what else? Okay, so I'm going to then go into the third aspect of crow analysis, which is the most subjective, which is the tonal. And this is what Danny was pointing to with his question about the change in the tone, because when you add airspeed to the crow, because that doesn't just necessarily point to a pitch instability, it also can be pointing to a tonal instability. Right? There's a subtle difference between pitch instability and tone instability. Of course, they're very connected, but there is a difference between the two. So, how do we test that? Well, exactly like what Danny was talking about. You add airspeed to your crow and you see how the tone changes and evolves. So, we're measuring how quickly the bottom octave enters the picture, what nature the bottom octave has. Is it louder than the top octave? Does it rattle? And we're also observing the overall sort of quality of the sound as you add airspeed. Does it stay sort of rounded and whole, or does it start to sound splayed and wild? Right? So sometimes you can have a reed that when you crow it really softly, it sounds terrific, but as you add airspeed, it gets crazy. That says there's an instability, a tonal instability somewhere in the reed. Something's been overscraped. There's not enough definition somewhere, something of that sort. So with this day one read I have, as I add airspeed to my crow, there's no change in the nature of the sound. The bottom octave comes in late, meaning it comes in after the top octave, which is how I like it. Now, in the case of this day one read, it comes in too late. It's actually the bottom octave. I would want it to be ultimately a little bit more present and immediate than it is on this read. But as I told you guys before, I tend to leave my day one reads feeling a little too tight because they do tend to sink and open up a little bit over that first night of drying.
So my crow on this reed sounds really wild, but when I put it in the oboe, it sounds good.
Then don't touch it. you know, I really 95% of the time the crow of a reed and the way it functions in the oboe is absolutely parallel, predictable, and makes total sense. 5% of the time it's absolutely mysterious and insane.
Elusive.
Yes, so you might have found one of those. I've had reads that crow in a way that makes me sure it'll sound and function not very well, but then it does. And I've had the opposite where I have a reed that crowed really exactly right and beautifully, and yet when I played in the oboe, it wasn't what I thought. But those are pretty rare. Those are pretty rare. So I don't know what to tell you. Now, the only thing I can tell you is there is the possibility, Bradley, that when you're playing it in the oboe, you're helping it out a little bit more than you realize. You're helping it maybe a little more than you are when you're crowing it. So step one is you have to be 100% certain that when you're playing it in the oboe, you're not giving it any assistance that you're not giving it when you crow it, because that could account for some of the difference you're experiencing in the quality. And I've noticed for some students, it's very hard for them to unpack how much they're helping a reed when they crow it. It's really hard for them to even, know to even realize that that's happening at all. It takes a great deal. That's why I stress the octave test so much, because the octave test will really teach you how to get out of the reed's way, to not help it and not voice it, and to see what the reed itself wants to do. Sharp B crow. What are you asking, Maddie?
That's just what I'm working with.
Well, that's a great place to be.
Okay.
Is that your day one read?
Yeah, this is the same read, but
And
there's no bottom octave.
Okay, so it's crowing underneath a C, but there's no bottom octave. Okay, so then that means you have to now, first of all, how much bottom octave do you typically get? Because some people don't really get any bottom octave when they crow their reeds. So that may not be a reed issue, that may be a you issue. Do you tend to get bottom octave?
I do, but that's usually when the reed is in general really buzzy.
Okay, so I'm not sure then I would worry so much about the lack of bottom octave right now. You may need to try your reed in an oboe to really ascertain the information that a bottom octave is typically giving, which is whether or not the reed has enough depth, right? So what you need to resolve then is getting the pitch up to at least a C for now. So what are the options for how to do that? What's the most obvious option?
To clip it?
Exactly, but what has it?
Did he freeze for everybody else?
Damn, he was about to say it.
What does it need to be doing in order to close? It wasn't me, it was every one of you. So what does a reed need to be doing in order to be clipped?
Responding well?
Responding freely enough. So if that reed feels a little resistant, then you need to make sure that you resolve the resistance before you clip it. You just have to resolve the resistance in a way that's hopefully not going to make it lower further. And that's really going to be some thoughtful, careful tip work. So, but do you feel like it is free blowing enough?
Yeah, it doesn't feel too resistant.
Then clip that bad boy.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and leave it there for today. Okay. So I hope this was informative. I hope that, you discovered some things. Olivia, if you want to, maybe we should share this recording to make it easily accessible for people. Is that something that we can do?
Yeah, once it downloads onto my laptop, I'll email it to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll post it or something online so people can access it there.
Okay.
Okay? Good. Thank you guys. Good work today. I look forward, I believe next week is going to be our freshman lit class. So I look forward to hearing the three of you guys play. And I hope everybody has a great weekend. Maddie, I'll see you in about 10 minutes. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.